Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great honor to be the moderator for this panel on economic and cultural factors dealing with the evolution of India. And there are 5 great presentations that we have here, but I first want to thank Provost Pritchett for actually funding this important initiative. And also I want to talk a bit about Amy's role. Amy talked about this, I think, about 2.5 years ago, and it's wonderful to see so much progress in such a short time. Penn has 160 faculty working on India with 270 research projects, but financial support matters and institutional support matters. So please join me in thanking our sponsors for this important work. I'm Harbir Singh. I'm the director of the Huntsman program from Wharton, and very much committed to understanding of global and cross-national issues in business and in economics. I'll just briefly give the guidelines. It's 3 slides, 5 minutes, and I may have a motion like this, which means 30 seconds, so that we will get to questions. I'll ask 1 or 2 questions, but I'll open it up to everyone here. So with that, let me invite our first speaker, Aline Gatignon, and her project is on cross-sector collaboration and the implementation of CSR, corporate social responsibility, after the 2013 reform of the Indian Companies Act. Very, very important issue. Ali?
Okay, good afternoon. First of all, I'd really like to thank Penn Global for their support and really reiterate everything that Harbir's just said. I really appreciate this opportunity to participate in the symposium today. I'm going to be providing an update on the project that I presented last year, in which my colleague Christiane Bode and I are examining firms' decisions to implement their corporate social responsibility projects either directly on their own within the firm or through NGO partnerships. So if we could flip to the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. I've got the control. Got it. So the 2013 amendment to the Indian Companies Act, which is often referred to kind of colloquially as the India CSR law, it mandates that firms above a certain size should contribute 2% of net profits to corporate social responsibility programs on an annual basis. It also requires that they report to the Indian government about their spending. And this gives us a really unique opportunity to examine the donation patterns across large numbers of firms in India in a way that we haven't really been able to do before. So Christiana and I have been analyzing data from the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, which houses the government data, covering 71,000 projects that have been implemented in the first 3 years since the reform was implemented. We've also complemented these analyses with qualitative data from interviews with diverse stakeholders in India, and I'd really like to give a shout out to Tishya and to UPSC for all their help. They've been really instrumental in setting up this set of interviews for us and helping us with the field work last March, and we're really grateful for that. So a key issue that emerged from these interviews was the firm's choice of how to implement their CSR projects with 2 broad options available to them: direct implementation on their own, on the one hand, or through partnerships with a nonprofit organization on the other. And when we looked at the data, we found that contrary to our expectations, 60% of the projects were actually being implemented by the firms rather than through partnerships with NGOs. And this is surprising given that CSR or social impact or social work is not really the core activity of businesses, whereas it is so for nonprofit organizations. And this is despite the fact that the branding implications are no different for the 2 options. So if you look at the picture at the top, you can see that the sponsor firm AIS, its name is on the signpost for the Unati Computer Center, which is managed by its NGO partner Youth Reach. But similarly, the rural library that is depicted in the picture on the bottom also has the logo of DLF, which implements this project through its foundation. So we really wanted to ask ourselves, how do firms actually go about making these decisions? What is driving these choices? Our analyses show that 2 broad types of considerations seem to be really underlying firms' decision of implementation mode. One has to do with their assessment of the relative capabilities of NGOs versus the firms themselves for implementing CSR, and the other has to do with their perceptions of the legitimacy that the firm and NGOs have for conducting these projects. So I'll give you a brief overview of some of the salient points of our analyses so far, although there's a lot more that I'd look forward to talking to you about offline as well if it's of interest. So first of all, we find that the more qualified NGOs are available in the social sector that they're looking at, whether it's healthcare, education, et cetera, then the more firms are likely to go through an NGO partnership. And conversely, what's also interesting is that we find that this isn't true for the geographic availability of NGOs. So if there are lots of NGOs available in one geographic state or another, doesn't seem to be affecting firms' decisions. So it seems that firms feel that social issue specialization is important, but geographic, these can be portable kind of across geographies. At least that seems to be the implication from their perspective. We also see that the more the firm invests in a geographically focused set of CSR projects, the less likely they are to implement any of these projects through an NGO partner. And one explanation potentially can be that if something goes wrong with that relationship, it can actually jeopardize the entire set of CSR projects that the firm has in a specific area as word of mouth spreads more easily. We also see that in terms of legitimacy, firms resort to NGO partners when there's a high level of social contention towards business interest in the state in which the project takes place. And so in these cases, firms seem to consider NGOs as potential buffers for social contention. But conversely, when there's a lot of social contention towards business interest in the social sector that they're looking at, so for instance, education or healthcare, under those circumstances, firms tend to consider NGOs more as the source, potentially, of that contention, and to be more concerned about partnering with them. So as you can see, there's a complex mix of factors that influence firms' decisions, and as a result, we often find that firms simply tend to follow the crowd, and the more other firms are engaging in direct implementation versus NGO partnerships, the more they will tend to follow that trend. And similarly, once they have picked one form of implementation, they tend to not reassess that decision and to continue along the same path going forward. We're still working on supplementary analyses. We welcome any input you can provide and look forward to talking more about you offline about the project. We're really excited about the potential implications going forward. Thank you very much.
And Aline was very much within the time frame. Thank you so much. I want to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ram Kannan from the School of Social Policy and Practice, talking about reversing the digital divide, digital banking in rural India. And while Ram's coming up, I think an interesting theme that I was thinking about that binds all these presentations is the glass half full version of India, which is great progress, great potential, and the glass half empty version, which is friction and impediments. Please.
Thank you. I want to start with two apologies. One, I have a 4 o'clock flight to catch. So after this Blitz, I'll have to run to the airport, and I apologize for the rest of the presenter. I wish I could be here. Second, I made a 43 slides presentation, and when I told 5 minutes, I said, forget about it. So I wrote a few notes, and I'll tell you about. My project is younger than some of the projects we just started this January. Clearly, the focus that we're interested in is cashless society, digital banking, whatever term you want to use for it. In 2016, 60% of the fiscal transaction in the developed world were electronic. In India at that time, it was only 5%. Government of India, in a broad term, is interested in e-banking, digital transactions, and there is a push for rural villages to come digital, to come cashless. When we applied a year ago, we talked about going to 4 southern states. In each state, find a village that was considered as cashless, go house to house and ask people how they use the cashless, in what way, which method they use, what way they are using it, and find a nearby village that has more or less the same size, and ask the same question there. Are you using e-banking? Are you using your phone for financial transaction? Are you working with your bank electronically? And similar set of questions that I can't go in detail here. Luckily, happily, we were awarded the grant. And our colleagues in India said, you know what? We will bring extra money. Let's do more state and have more or less a national coverage. So what we proposed to do was to go to those villages in 4 states, have about 200 families in each village, and have 1,600 households to cover. The idea was, and we implemented it with 2 of my doctoral students, to go to India, do the training. In every site, we collaborated with another university. We trained the local student in asking the question. In each state, not news for anybody in the room, we had to translate the questionnaire to a local language, make sure that the English version and the local language is similar. So in our training, we used both questionnaires, and we did fake interviews, role-playing, and make sure that the answers were the same. And then we went with bus to a village, 30, 40, 50 students, and knock on doors, asked the question. We collaborated with the village leadership that informed people that we are coming, that we are legit, that it's authorized and approved. We have very little rate of refusal. We did it in 4 or 5 different trips to India. Sadly, I lost my doctoral student to academic positions. So by the end of the project, I was left alone at Penn. I'm proud of them, but I'm missing them. We committed to do 4 states, 8 villages, which means 1,600 households. We ended up with 7 states, 14 villages, 3,200 responses. I can't give you any finding and any numbers. We just entered the data last month. We will start doing the analysis next month. We set time in a conference in San Diego to spend a day working on who is writing and analyzing what. I can tell you from my impressions that in many villages that declared cashless, it's not a great success. As 2 examples, in the last village we had great reception. All of us were amazed how well the infrastructure is. And then we all lost connection. We asked the local people, what's going on? Oh, we said, we have 1 router. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So you can't rely on it. In another village, the local merchant told us, maybe the government wants it, but we don't accept it. You want to come and buy here, you pay cash. It's much more complex than this, but what I believe is that we will be much more educated about who are the people that are ready and able to use digital banking, much more than the success of villages that are introduced to this technology. To be continued. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next presentation is on the labor market impact of microfinance initiatives by Professor Famida Handy, School of Social and Public Policy and Practice. And the interesting thing, by the way, is also the underground economy, which is cash. So there are many other issues that relate to this. Please.
So first of all, thank you for the grant. That was an amazing opportunity to carry out work. That was basically arose because of course, I teach in India on microfinance and self-help group movement. So I take students from Penn every year for the last 8 years. And we've been watching the self-help group movement change and grow and evolve in India. And one of the things I noticed when we were there is the goals of the self-help group movement, and that is to alleviate poverty, women's empowerment, and there's a lot of literature that looks at whether these goals are met or not. When we were there and we were discussing all this, one of my students remarked that look at all the people standing around us when we go to visit the self-help groups. Yes, we are in a group of Americans going to rural villages, and all of this is in Karnataka, so I limit my comments to Karnataka, is that there would be at least 10 people around, men and women, whilst we talked to the self-help groups, which were largely women. And it turned out that they were all employed in some form or the other to facilitate the self-help group movement and microfinance in India. So there would be field supervisors, animators, bank correspondents, people from the bank or the trust that was funding the MFIs and so on. And suddenly the penny dropped. It's like, okay, these people had no employment prior to the self-help group movement. And so there's something happening in the labor market, in the formal labor market, as a result of the microfinance movement. And this area has not been studied at all because it's really what I would call a positive externality or an ancillary impact of the microfinance movement. So while the literature abounds in all the results, and I have 5 minutes, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but I tried to cram like 8 slides into 3 slides. Just a rough polling of the women in self-help groups, we asked them, what would you prefer? Would you prefer regular employment, or would you like to do your dairy business and your entrepreneurial business that you can take loans from the self-help group movement? And 99.9, and I say that because there's one woman who consistently said they'd like to do the entrepreneur, would prefer a regular job, like most of us. To smooth out your consumption, you weren't smoothing income. And so really, as the World Bank says, India needs to create more jobs in the formal labor market. And though this was not the goal of the self-help group movement and the microfinance movement started by Narbad in 1991, this has been a huge impact in creating those very kinds of jobs that people really want, and that is in the formal labor market. So what we did is me and my doctoral student, Alison Russell, who's now my colleague, and a postdoctoral student here at Penn, we went to interview the different kinds of microfinance institutes. So they are sometimes started by government, sometimes by NGOs, sometimes by religious trusts, and sometimes by banks. So all the sectors are involved in this. And each one has a different organizational structure and therefore has different employment structures. So we tried to get an idea of how they employ people only related to this microfinance and self-help group movement. And so you can see we interviewed 25. So it's really a pilot study that we want to expand to different parts of India because I realize that different parts of India are very different. And we looked at the number of employees, and you can see some of the microfinance, which are small, have small number of self-help groups, have 8 employees, and the maximum runs to 18,000, with an average of about 1,000 people or more going into the formal labor market, so getting regular employment. But not all of them are hired at full time. So if the CEO of the bank is involved in the SAG movement, clearly all his time is not spent there. So we tried to calculate the full-time equivalents. And we get the full-time equivalents of about the average of 820, in addition to the number of volunteers that get involved with the MFI movement. But what's very important, and it's interesting to note, is that many of these jobs are created in the rural areas where exactly there is very little impact in the formal labor market. So the employees are themselves often members of the self-help groups. So they're getting the kinds of jobs they actually want. And whilst, yes, sadly, mostly the men are getting the jobs in the banks and the women are getting the jobs in the field, nevertheless, the numbers consider in Karnataka, just extrapolating from our 25, it's an estimate, I know this, is over 2.5 million SAGs, and we looked at it per SAG, and we get over 139,000 or nearly 140,000 people moving into the formal labor market because of the self-help group movement, creating the equivalent of over 100,000 full-time equivalent jobs in the labor market. As I said, this was not the goal of the microfinance movement or the self-help group movement, but this is the externality that was created from this movement. And then we also wanted to classify what kinds of jobs are happening. So not all jobs are equal, yes? And so we looked at the different kinds of jobs and we put them on a scale of 7. As you can see, they range from the CEO, the president of the director of the MFI, right down to people like attendants and drivers and office assistants. The numbers in red are the ones that are interesting to me because those jobs are being created in the rural areas where, in fact, employment is scarce, unemployment is very high, and I think this is one of the, a good news story that is created through an unintended consequence of the microfinance movement. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Professor Rajiv Allur from the School of Engineering and Applied Science on the safe Internet of Things.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So let me first thank the Provost and the university for giving us funding to develop some research collaborations with researchers in India on this topic. The PI for this project is Sampath Kannan, who actually he was supposed to be here on the panel, but because of a last-minute family emergency, he had to step out, so I'm filling in his shoes. So what's safe Internet of Things? So, well, if you haven't heard the phrase Internet of Things, it's about all these devices that are interacting with the physical world, collecting data, and then making decisions in real time. So this is an exciting new technology. In industry, sometimes it's called Industry 4.0, so that's like going to be the next revolution. So in fact, today only I'm hosting this Industry Day in the engineering school exactly on this topic, and we have about 150 folks from industry here. But unfortunately, because of that, I'll have to step out of this meeting after the panel. But when we deploy these things, there are lots of opportunities, but we cannot, in a hurry, deploy them without thinking about the consequences. And the biggest consequence is, can we trust these technologies? And there are a variety of issues. So one is safety. So are these things making decisions in a safe manner, particularly when we deploy them in applications such as autonomous driving and healthcare? Another issue is about ethics. Are these systems taking decisions in a fair manner? So, for example, maybe they are discriminating if we are using this type of a system to decide on whom to give a loan to, so there are lots of these ethical issues, and researchers in computer science are increasingly thinking about the social consequences of deploying these modern systems in contexts where they're affecting society. So the motivation for this project was to increase awareness among research institutions in India about this emerging topic, and and also engage with Penn alumni. So there are lots of engineering alumni. So I think Wharton has more of connections with the alumni in India. So here, one of the things we want to do is to establish more connections with engineering alumni. Actually, as India is advancing, there are lots of new startups in the tech space, but we don't have such good connections. So, so we thought, oh, this would be a good subspace in technology where we could develop these connections. So the bulk of the funds were used for organizing these two activities in last December. So on January 10th, earlier this year, we had two parallel day-long research meetings, both hosted at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. And one was focused on safety. How do we make sure that these systems with modern machine learning components are safe, so that at design time you can get a higher assurance about how well they're working. And then the second one was focused more on fairness and privacy. Are they keeping data private? Are they making decisions in a fair manner? Are these decisions ethical? Can we trust them? And both of these meetings turned out to be big successes. Each one had over 100 participants, not just from Indian Institute of Science, but from a variety of engineering colleges in and around Bangalore, and also a number of research labs in Bangalore, including US companies like Microsoft and Google have research labs in Bangalore, so these people also showed up at these meetings. And on the following day, we had a day-long Penn India Summit in Bangalore, where the Dean of Engineering was also there, and yeah, I was there, and Professor Kannan was there, and a few other Penn faculty. And we had a variety of panels, but again, the focus was on entrepreneurship, trying to connect with Penn alumni who are trying to start new businesses in this space, and it turned out to be a great experience. We also held an information session in the evening for students to apply to Penn, and this was, of course, very popular, and hundreds of students showed up. Yes, so this is just a few, I guess, the posters from these two events. So one was this Penn India Summit on focused on engineering, and the other one was the session focused on students. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Revati Prasad, speaking about infrastructure and discourses of connectivity in India.
Great. Thank you so much for convening this space. It's really great to learn about other India-focused research happening at Penn. The work I'm presenting is about a larger project about internet connectivity efforts in India. As context, India has the second largest number of internet users in the world, but that only accounts for about 30% of the population that has internet access, and that's mostly mobile access, and it's pretty low in rural areas, which obviously has other implications. So there's a widespread consensus between state, nonprofits, industry that we need to address internet connectivity issues. So you've got ambitious government projects about laying down 1 million kilometers of fiber optic cables or deploying millions of Wi-Fi hotspots. Google is a partner, Tata is a partner on some of these. I'm looking at these various efforts and asking, when we say we're connecting the unconnected, which is the umbrella term for these efforts, what are we connecting them to? What are we connecting them for? So I don't know where I stand on the glass half full, glass half empty. I would say I'm trying to ascertain what's in the glass. Today I'm talking about a state government project in Andhra Pradesh that began after the state was bifurcated in 2014 into Andhra and Telangana, and after the 2014 election of Chandrababu Naidu. It's called the Andhra Pradesh State FiberNet Limited project, or just AP Fiber. I spent a few months earlier this year working with the staff and partners of the project to understand what it is that they're trying to do and how the network operates on the ground. AP Fiber is an infrastructure in a few senses of the word. It is comprised of a network operations center in Vizag or Visakhapatnam. It has a network of 24,000 kilometers of aerial fiber that crisscross across the state and terminate in 2,500 or so points of presence, or POPs. They claim that they're within 5 kilometers of about 85% of the state's population through these POPs. Institutionally, it's a state corporation that exists within the energy department because they're layering the fiber on top of electric infrastructure. So they're stringing it up on poles and they're using substations to house the POPs. The choice of aerial fiber was incredibly significant because it made the network cheaper and faster to deploy. No digging required, no right-of-way. By their estimate, they spent a tenth of the cost it would have to do underground fiber, and they had the network built in about a year. And speed was very important for them. From these POPs, the optical line terminal, which is the third photo, a network of local cable operators drags the fiber to people's home to provide the last mile connectivity. To the end users, however, AP Fiber is first and foremost a television service. They deliver internet, cable, and voice services, but the primary interface for users is the television. So that's your home screen when you turn it on. I don't know what happens after the election, if that's been replaced, if Chandrababu Naidu's face has been replaced by Jagan's face, the new chief minister, or if they've gone a different route with their branding. But my questions to the staff and partners were, why do this? And then why do it this particular way? Television is a Trojan horse here. APSFL staff told me that there was no demand in rural areas for internet specifically. So the idea was to bundle it with an essential service, cable TV, for a pedagogical purpose. So you would teach them to go from live TV to the App Store, where they have YouTube, and presto, you're on the internet. When I asked what this kind of connectivity could achieve, the overwhelming response is growth. It's an article of faith for them. They'll say it to me like it's a formula. 10% increase in broadband penetration is going to lead to 1.32% increase in GDP. It's a digital infrastructure for a digital economy. It's going to lead to more startups. It's going to draw industry to this state. Although they're not very clear about the causation for that part. What they are clear about is that AP Fiber can deliver and platform an entire rural population and now create data consumers, and eventually the hope is gig workers for industry. The idea of digital economy is also connected to the second rationale that really resonates with the project staff, and that is of glory. The staff spoke about Andhra Pradesh as a badly beaten state in the wake of the bifurcation, where they had lost the IT powerhouse of Hyderabad to Telangana, so they needed to rebuild, and they needed to demonstrate that they could just be just as technologically advanced. That's the Polavaram Dam, which is this other massive government infrastructure project that APSL staff repeatedly referenced. It's another example of the state rebuilding and rebuilding on a very grand scale. You can watch it being built on the AP Fiber platform. They have a network of 20,000 surveillance cameras, and you can watch the feed of a few of them that are trained on the big infrastructure projects. So the dam, the building of the new capital city of Amravati on your television. The image of the dam to me also represents the third rationale, that of governance. APSFL staff argue that the platform would lead to better governance because it would now mediate the relationship between citizen and state. The government would be able to deliver services right to people's home because they can collect data on a real-time basis. And perhaps after we can talk about what that data collection looks like. In return, the government would be more accountable to the people because citizens can watch what their government is doing. We can monitor for ourselves whether the government is doing the things they said it would do. Of course, what they present as transparency enabled by technology is actually just TV programming. It's a carefully curated feed meant to demonstrate the prowess of the state. While it talks about empowerment, AP Fiber tends to function like other infrastructure projects in the Global South as a spectacle of modernity that is working to reinscribe state power. I'd love to talk to you guys more about it.
Thank you very much. When I first saw the titles of the talks, I was inspired, but now I'm extremely inspired. I think this is wonderful, wonderful material. I'm just going to make a couple of general observations and seek some reactions, but then I'm really curious what you think. Basically, all the projects are about contemporary India, and I think it serves to establish some, potentially after the studies, some regularities about some very important things. There are three intersecting forces that we are talking about. One of them is, in fact, the rise of new technological infrastructure and the democratization of access to technology, which is fundamental in India, and I think is an engine of growth. The second one is innovative organizational models, whether they're business models or societal models or micro-organizational models, and how they evolve. And the third one is really about stakeholders and the larger legitimacy issues that surround these new models. And the thought I have is that perhaps our presenters can briefly respond to this, which is what do we see as the sort of the main positive drivers of new infrastructure, and maybe one possible source of friction? I mean, we can just talk about that perhaps across the presentations. Would anybody like to start? Maybe Revati, you already started, so you can talk a bit about the television and those, and how the themes are being presented.
So in terms of positive drivers, it's difficult for someone who studies telecom infrastructure in India to consider this completely positive, but Jio has been pretty transformative to the level of internet access in the country. There are other complications in terms of political economy for the kinds of power reliance has, But for a user basis, of course, more and more people on a daily basis are able to access internet services and are much more capable on mobile devices. In terms of friction, there is this faith in technology that doesn't get questioned very much. And at least from my perspective, what I'm seeing is a lot of the switching of where people used to mediate the relationship between state and citizens, where you could go to a person, where you knew people. There's a push to make everything an app, which has, of course, its limitations because it's very insufficient
Well, it's
for a number
also
of
a very
reasons.
young country, so apps is what everybody's excited about. But thank you, that's
We are
great.
excited, yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, so my view is more from engineering and technology, but I think a big driver now is the availability of venture capital and just the number of young people who are excited about technology and are willing to take risks. So talking about apps, so at this meeting in Bangalore, we met so many, so many young entrepreneurs who were thinking about a variety of startups in healthcare, but in the end, of course, the way they were going to provide reach people is like through these apps. But the core challenge there is how to build the right infrastructure, and so a lot of excitement in terms of what new businesses can be started in that space. Yeah.
Wonderful.
In the self-help group movement and in the microcredit movement, clearly technology has played a huge role because now people don't have to trudge to the local bank correspondent and can do it online on their mobile phones. So what I've seen actually over the 10 years that I've been going to rural Karnataka is the number of women in the self-help groups that take out telephones or mobile phones and are doing what my students do, looking for information, which has meant that they are much more empowered to ask kind of questions that I never heard before. And so in this sense, I think that the technology that's getting to the rural villages, at least in Karnataka, where it seems the connectivity is much better than in other places, that the women in the self-help groups are more, they were already empowered, just access to credit and to finance, but now with access to the internet, they seem to be much more questioning of some of the policies that are going on.
Some of the PowerPoint slides that I didn't bring was related to our motivation to go and study the digital divide. We know from many studies that poor people, lower education people, have more problem adjusting to the internet and to the other digital devices. Now that financial institutions are coming, that banks without tellers, banks online, we were interested in the divide, and as I said, our impression is that there is a major divide between people in the city and people in rural area. Findings yet to come, but there was a major issue that drives us to understand how a society with so many people living in rural area is expected to jump so quickly. Another observation is, in one way, India is ahead of the United States, and this is telephone paying. There are about 10 schemes by which people move money from their account to other people, individual or banks, in a way that it's totally unparalleled here. We have one, maybe 1.5 system, and I bet that if I pull you, less than half of you are using it. So in this respect, the cell phone is much more advanced as a mode of technology, but everything else, be it the infrastructure, the education, the opportunity, it's the opposite.
So while my work doesn't necessarily speak to technology and physical infrastructure per se, I think what we're seeing are new opportunities for the private sector to participate in the development of an institutional infrastructure to address some of the gaps that we see in India today. I think one of the drawbacks from the results we're seeing is that potentially if this happens when different sectors operate in parallel rather than hand in hand, we might end up with multiple systems and missed opportunities.
and 2% of their net income is supposed to go into corporate social responsibility, which is huge. So with that, I want to open it up to the audience for any questions you might have for the panel. Yes, please.
In India, you have energy poverty, food scarcity, and water scarcity. Were any of these corporate projects aimed at addressing those issues?
Could you repeat the three, please?
You have energy poverty, food scarcity, and water scarcity issues in India. Were any of these projects aimed at dealing with those issues?
Yes, absolutely. So the way that the law is set up, there is a list of different categories that CSR projects can slot into. And the categories are very inclusive, and certainly projects that address all of the issues that you've addressed would qualify.
Thank you. My comment is about CSR. An argument can be made that CSR is an inefficient way of promoting broader welfare, that a company should be allowed to focus on its core competence, and if indeed the government wanted companies to contribute more, the best way would be to tax them more and spend it. But the rationale for CSR is that you must have corporates experience social responsibility, the broader movement of shift from shareholder to stakeholder. If that is indeed the rationale, should corporates be given an option to redeem their CSR through the NGO route? They should be asked to do it themselves, right? You are actually militating against your own rationale by giving them a choice to go through the NGO route. You have any comment on that?
Yes, so I think definitely when the law was set into place, the idea was not to have a kind of checkbook philanthropy, but really to leverage some of the expertise and capabilities of the private sector. I think where many of the hopes were set was that in creating more interactions across sectors, and in particular the nonprofit and the for-profit sector, we would get to synergies and new innovative ways of addressing some of these issues, where I think the best of both worlds can be leveraged. I think what our results are pointing to is that we're unable to get at the depth of engagement, whether this is outsourcing projects to corporates, to nonprofits, or whether there's real partnership involved. But I think certainly kind of the way forward to get the best of both worlds, as you say, I think is probably through some level of deep integration across sectors, and that's difficult to get at. And under what conditions that's possible, I think is not necessarily very straightforward.
So wonderful. And the thing I will add is that Milton Friedman had this original argument about the shareholder being the primary stakeholder. But that debate is now revitalized in the US as well as to whether firms should be thinking more broadly. But I think it's a very important point about the efficient allocation of resources across the economy. Other questions? Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you. Please speak louder.
Hello. Okay. So my question was we saw that these microfinance units and self-help groups are creating this positive externality and they're generating employment. And I'm wondering if there is any policy implication about this, can this be used to, what is your suggestion? How can we use these self-help groups to reach out to other places where there are employment issues? What is a policy implication of your research, basically?
Well, I just presented this paper and the results at a conference, and I was basically told that nobody's really looked at the implications the way we're looking at it in the labor market. So this is a first, and this is just based in Karnataka. What I think is what might come out of something like this is to recognize that it has failed largely on eradicating poverty. Let's be clear on that. The research mostly shows empowerment of women, but has failed very badly on eradicating poverty, which it was set out to do. But if we can gather data on other things like nutrition levels, empowerment levels, et cetera, what SHGs are doing, then that platform can be used exactly for the things that they're good at, rather than pushing this eradicating poverty through access to finances. And if some of the positive externalities are coming out as creating the very kinds of things that the World Bank is saying that we should create in rural India, then I think that the policy implication is that maybe government should, in Karnataka it's very well penetrated, but other parts of India not so. And I want to take this research to other parts of India where the penetration of self-help groups is much lower than Karnataka. And I think the results from Karnataka can inform governments in other places for the penetration of MFIs and self-help groups.
So I would just like to make one final point and thank our speakers, and that is that India is highly heterogeneous. It is exciting. There's a lot of growth opportunity. The stakeholder issues are more complex than in the US, certainly. But I think what we need, if you think about Penn's role in all of this, is thought leadership, and also go to our strengths, which is what we are doing. But most importantly, I think we need an empirical base. There's a lot of debate without empirical base, and we need empirical base. And please join me in thanking our speakers for providing this empirical base. So wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you for moderating.